Sorry, I'm just a little bit late with my streaming today here because of certain technical issues. But we will take up the second lecture in our discussion of Defoe, and we will discuss today Defoe's The Complete English Tradesman, which is part and parcel of the CBCS syllabus, also in the reading list, in the non-detailed reading list, as it were. Now, we will, of course, take a look at this. But once again, before I come to that, as I yesterday specified, the Defoe's lingering interest in trade was one of a continuous process that evolved right from his youth. And we know how he started his businesses. He went bankrupt, and then he sort of rose again, and then once again was pilloried, and how he ended his life fleeing from debtors also. Therefore, in a sense, trade was something which was very close to Defoe's heart. But the proper, if you call it the proper way of trading, and to create a manual for trade, was something that was very close to his heart, as it were. In that sense, that Defoe was always looking at something, some kind of a treatise that would be a comprehensive the process of trade for the people of England. Now, by the 18th century, this discourse of economic writing and trade was, of course, reaching a zenith in England. The practice of business and concerns of literature had begun to intersect at an interesting rate. With the growing importance of commerce, increasing numbers of literary figures inevitably came into closer contact with wit. But let me argue that Defoe's sort of interiority into trade was never matched by anybody else. Elsewhere, he wrote in the review that writing on trade was the whore I really doted upon. Now, that's a very interesting metaphor to use, really. Saying writing on trade was a whore I really doted upon, freed from the burden of journalism and fiction. Now, this is what led to his essay on projects in 1697, where Defoe was articulating different kinds of projects, economic projects that could be brought up. Please remember that one of the projects that he was talking about included, setting up with government help on the uninhabited islands of Venezuela, a kind of a British colony, which would then trade with the local people. And Defoe suggested that if England invested in this project, the returns would be extremely significant. The sort of project was never really taken up, but it remains, the bedrock through which Defoe was later on to write Robinson Crusoe, which is a kind of a fictional equivalent of that project. Now, interestingly, towards the end of his literary career, and this is 1725, Defoe actually sort of made this potential writing or compendium on trade a possibility, and this is when he sort of wrote the Complete English Tradesman. This is a huge treatise on almost around 900 pages. And Defoe here talks about manufacture, he talks about punctuality, he talks about the ethics of thrift, he talks about projects, he talks about government intervention, he talks about trading, he talks about the stock exchange, and so on and so forth. Now, very often these stories about trade are given an anecdotal form, and he uses biblical parables, Newgate gossip. He talks about catalogues of English textiles, including Yorkshire wool, Berkshire saloon, drugget, and so on and so forth. Now, Defoe therefore becomes the high priest of English mercantilism, and he therefore talks about several lessons that trade can impart. But given this 900-page treatise, what I'm going to look at are some of the salient points that Defoe makes about trade Englishness and what trade means to the nation. I'm not going to talk about the practice of trading and the kind of the intricacies of trade and commerce. I am rather going to concentrate on what exactly does trade mean for the nation, because that is going to be important for our discussion of Robinson Crusoe. And it is with this in mind that I am projecting a segment from the complete English Tradesman, and I'll share my screen with you in a minute, where you'll find an abridged text of the complete English Tradesman here. This is just 8 odd pages which I have selected, and I've selected this because of its relevance to Robinson Crusoe, really. Now, Defoe begins by arguing that British traders, rather than the landed gentry, are the ones who are really to be honored. We may venture to say that at the same time are very far from doing dishonor to the nobility. It is very well known that besides the benefit which we reap by being a trading nation, now that's the first point that Defoe makes, that England is a trading nation, which is our principal glory. So no longer does Defoe suggest that England is a martial nation, England is a nation of the landed gentry. He suggests the identity of England is driven saliently by its trading sort of patterns. And our trade is very different, he says. Trade is a very different thing in England than it is in many other countries, and is carried on by persons who, in both their education and descent, are far from being the dregs of the people. So he argues that traders in England are far more educated, belong to a well-established class, and are appreciated by society rather than in any other nation. Now, next he refers to King Charles II and suggests that Charles had acknowledged, so he's writing about the Restoration. So already, I remind you, 1600 East India Company, 1660 the restoration of monarchy, and he's quoting Charles II to say that tradesmen were the only gentry in England. Now, you'll remember that when I talked about the Spectator papers with you, I had talked about how, on board the Spectator papers, Addison places as almost his equal of Sir Roger de Coverley, Sir Andrew Freeport. So not only is Defoe acknowledging that the tradesman is given a rare eminence in British society, Addison is doing the same. Is projecting, both Defoe and Addison are thereby projecting the tradesman as hero, the trader, the merchant as hero. Remember, in Your Rape of the Lock also, you have the comparison of the life of ease that Belinda lives, and the court sort of suffers idle gossip, whereas the tradesman from the exchange goes home at peace. So in almost every author, the tradesman is given an eminence that is nowhere found in the other parts of Europe. That is what Defoe suggests. And Defoe's argument is that there are 3 points about the importance of trade in society. First, that we are the greatest trading society in the world because we have the greatest export and the greatest import and consumption of the growth product and manufactures of other countries from abroad. You'll remember that Sir Roger de Coverley refers to the sea as the British common. And Defoe, far in advance of Adam Smith, is arguing that England is great because of the wealth, not of its own nation, but because of the wealth of nations, in the way free trade, import and export is possible. Right. So Defoe is that great apologist for British colonialism, for British overseas trade, for British maritime trade that makes the English such a very powerful nation. Secondly, of course, he talks about the climate, which forces people to go outdoors. And then he talks about the health of the British nation. So the English are, scientifically advanced. The English are physically advanced and fitter, and therefore more apt to go out into the wide world and make their positions. So, Defoe is sort of bringing together the physique of the nation as well as the desire of the nation to export and import, and thereby drawing a salient identity of the British race as a race of traders. Right. Now, notice that Defoe is thereby writing against the grain. You see, for example, contemporary France or Portugal or Spain would talk about its nation's martial valor, its great palaces, gentries, and so on and so forth. Defoe, on the other hand, is not only negating that, but taking positive pride in the fact that English society is dominated by traders. It is here that you see the identity of the Britisher as the explorer, the colonizer, and the trader becomes so very important. And it is in this context, therefore, that you should take a look at Defoe's text, the Robinson Crusoe. And he suggests that our noble and wealthy families are raised and derived by trade. And he suggests that trade is the readiest way for men to raise their fortunes and families. Now, this is a very strong ethic that he's trying to bring in. The trade brings money, improves the nation, improves the condition of people, and is better than war. Right. So, and then you see, for the first time, Defoe is here using the word wealth of the nation. And that's very interesting. If you look at this particular phrase, Defoe is suggesting it does not lie locked in landed estates. He's suggesting it lies chiefly among the trading part of the people. And thereby, Defoe now having valorized the tradesman, now attacks the landed gentry. He says, how many? By whom have the prodigious taxes been paid, the loans supplied, and money advanced upon all occasions of war? By whom are banks and companies carried on, and on whom are the customs and excises levied? Have not the trade and tradesmen borne the burden of the war? If you look at that passage carefully, Defoe is taking away the preeminence of the landed gentry as leading the war. And if you note that, very often in these particular moments of war, the generals were all drawn from the landed gentry. Defoe suggests that it was not the case. They did not win the war. It was the traders' money which went into the finance of the war, and therefore the possibility of victory. Right. So then he suggests that tradesmen are gradually replacing the landed gentry in almost all parts of England. So how common is it to see a tradesman go off the stage with 10 to 40,000 pounds estate to divide among his family? When on the contrary, take the gentry in England, and Defoe is extremely critical about the gentry, from one end to the other, with what excessive high living, which is of late grown into so much of a disease, they are in debt, and a great many of the other estates also. So he sees the landed gentry essentially as lazy and idle, something which even Pope also talks about. And therefore, you see, there is this sense at this point of time in English society, that the English traders as a class are ascending and replacing gradually the preeminence of the landed gentry. Right. And then he talks about the noble seats do we see erected within the miles of the city by tradesmen, while the seats and castles of the ancient gentry look worn out and fallen into decay. I'll remind you of Sir Roger essays once again, and the metaphor that Addison uses for Roger and his estate: old, aged, in decline. And therefore, Defoe is suggesting that the class churning is actually taking place in England, whereby the old and decaying landed gentry is being replaced by the more dynamic and powerful sort of merchant class. And then he comes to this concept of how there is a cascading effect whereby the trader actually sort of uplifts society by his habit of spending. Now, one of the very interesting things that we could also take a look at here is that Defoe's text is one of those fundamental texts of English capitalism, where he sees capitalism and the growth of the traders' profits as having a trickle-down effect on the rest of society. And that it is this great growth of capitalism that is witnessing a transformation within a dominantly feudal society. Right. So within the feudal society, of course, the peasant is rooted to his land, and he is rooted to others are rooted to their professions. Defoe suggests that together with capitalism, the growth of the trader, the growth of trade and commerce, and the gradual movement to the city, and this is the time when the large industrial cities are coming into the forefront, if not industrial, then the maritime cities, Bristol, Liverpool, Manchester, where import and export taking place. Thereby, these urban centers are becoming the real hubs through which English prosperity is growing. So Defoe is seeing trade as the catalyst or the transformative agent which is uplifting English society. They're suggesting, I say a shoemaker in London shall keep a better house and yet grow rich too. And then comes a very interesting metaphor where Defoe compares feudal society based on the estate to a pond. But trade, he compares to a spring, which is regenerating itself forever and forever, and the pond is stagnant. So trade is an unexhausted current which keeps the pond full, but continuously runs over and fills all the lower ponds and places about it. So we can see, how Defoe is celebrating colonial goods, riches, money, bullion, which is transforming English society from a feudal economy to a vibrant sort of economy of excess. So a trade being so vastly great, tradesmen fill the lists of our nobility. And therefore, trade in England makes the gentleman. So Defoe is here suggesting that we need, or England needs, to revise the notion of that the trader is the new hero. You see, Robinson Crusoe is that archetype of the English trading mentality, whereby it is looking at undiscovered land, the spirit of exploration, the exploitation of nature and its resources, and the creation of a surplus. Now, obviously, because Defoe is marooned on his island, the transformation of nature, trading class. So Defoe is, of course, talking here about the remains of mechanic blood, the gallantry, spirit of greatness of soul, and generous principles of the trader. So it's a new validity, it's a new heroism that Defoe is ascribing to the English trading people. And the tradesmen of England are seen as virile, brave, generous, and adventurous, always ready to take a risk. And he suggests that, in the late wars between England and France, he suggests that, trade in England is far more important than warfare. And this is something that Defoe kept on harping. You see, that peace ought to be attained at all ends, and that trade should not be disrupted even in times of war. And therefore, the argument is that in England, trading is what distinguishes it. And the tradesmen, many of our best families rose from trade. And then Defoe goes into another direction. And he suggests that women very often look down upon traders, but they should really recognize the trader as a new hero and should marry into the trading families, because it is in the tradesmen that the new nobility can be located. He's also suggesting that societally, the tradesman is given a far greater honor in society. Now, you see, every society has its way of honoring particular people. Say in Bengal, for example, the trader is looked down upon, frowned upon, really, whereas the intellectual is looked up to. On the other hand, in Gujarat, for example, the intellectual takes a backseat. The trader is the one whom people live up or people look up to. So every society has its own distinct way of looking at different classes of people. And Defoe argues that in England, tradesman does not sound as harsh as it does in other countries. So the trader gentleman is the new category that the Englishmen look forward to. And then Defoe asks this question: how did this happen? How did the tradesman come to occupy a new space in English society? How did the exchange replace the court? And he says that war has not done this, right? He says we have not added anything to the British Empire. We have not done anything to defeat Britain and France. Rather, we have lost a few dominions. But why have we done this? Not by the sword, but by allowing to trade. Now, of course, when Defoe is writing this, the crown has not taken over the dominions. Colonization has not become a state phenomenon. It is still restricted to the East India Company. And therefore, the East India Company is an independent entity that is primarily trading in the different parts of the globe. It has not yet become this behemoth and this almost state in itself. So Defoe is writing this at the point of time when, colonialism has not entered into its latter stages. He's suggesting that we have become, great because of trade, and new discoveries have been made in lands unknown. Remind you of Robinson Crusoe. New settlements and plantations made, new colonies planted, new governments formed in uninhabited islands and the uncultivated continent of America. And those plantings and settlements have again enlarged and increased the trade. So, take a cue to Robinson Crusoe, the island uninhabited. Defoe claims it is my island, and I am the undisputed king of this place. Right, so colonialism, travel, exploration, trade, and the gradual laying down of government. We have not increased our power by subduing the nations, but have entirely planted our colonies and peopled the countries with our own subjects. So, he's suggesting that there are a vast amount of colonies where British people have gone, Americas, England, India, and so on and so forth. We have not enslaved them, but we have made them part of our trading empire. So it has kept our people at home, where they are multiplied to that prodigious degree, and England will become, drawing upon that utopian Garden of Eden, where the resources of the colonies will feed that garden, make it an utopia, feed their cows, and their corn and cattle be supplied from Scotland and Ireland. And he says, what is but trade? But the increase of business at home and the employment of the poor in the business and manufactures of the kingdom. So trade is seen as the great agent, which will then eradicate poverty and uplift the poor from their states. And therefore, Defoe is urging them to settle, to migrate and to settle in the colonies, so that this process of trading can be multiplied manyfold. You see how Defoe goes on to become the great champion of colonialism. The trade that keeps our people at home is the cause of the well-being of the people here. So people get much, spend much, work hard, live well, drink well, clothe warm, lodge soft. So trade is that great, almost aphrodisiac, which breathes a new vitality into the state of England, uplifts the poor, and radically sort of transforms their standard of living. It increases the rent and value of the lands. As people get greater wages, it increases greater consumption. And therefore, Defoe concludes, this is the most important paragraph here, the whole glory and greatness of England then being raised by trade, it must be unaccountable folly and ignorance in us to lessen that one article in our esteem, which is the only fountain from whence we all take us as a nation. So quintessentially then, Defoe suggests that a new English nationalism is built upon the fountainhead of trade and the trading classes. And therefore, he's drawing attention to similar conditions in Persia and India of earlier times, where her merchants were her princes. So Defoe's entire text, the selection that we've taken, is directed really at acknowledging that trade and commerce is in reality the new summum bonum of English nationalism, that the tradesman is the new hero of a New England, and that the government policies should hereby be directed towards the upliftment of trade, which will in turn lead to greater colonialism, greater discoveries, more import and export, and a radical transformation of England into a Garden of Eden. So this is what fundamentally the complete English tradesman sort of talks about. And there's also this metaphor that he uses at the end of the text, which I have not really sort of projected before you, is that of the tradesman as that great phoenix. And he suggests never despair. Is a kind of a phoenix, the tradesman, who often rises out of his own ashes and makes the ruin of his fortunes be a firm foundation to build his recovery. So the complete English tradesman then becomes, an assertion that it is the trading mentality that will thereby lead England to rise into great glory, and that colonialism is the force through which the identity of England is going to be built and articulated. Therefore, what have I argued in this particular session? I've argued that in the complete English tradesman, Defoe is writing for the first time a comprehensive economic treatise, economic writing. It's a manual of how to carry on trade, but it's also a manual which for the first time recognizes the importance of colonialism within and trade within the British social fabric. It establishes the merchant as hero. It firmly sets the merchant against the landed gentry and suggests that the landed gentry is a pond, whereas the merchant is that spring which leads to the vitality of England. It talks about the necessity and the ability of the Englishman to trade. And it talks about colonialism as the great force rather than warfare, which has led to the transformation of England into a Garden of Eden. Now, this is the economic treatise. How is this transferred into the fictional realm is what we shall look at in our next classes. And tomorrow, I will begin with Robinson Crusoe, and I will talk about the composition and the sources of Robinson Crusoe. It's important for us to recognize that the ideas which Defoe were manifesting in the complete English tradesman were the ideas that went into the making of Robinson Crusoe and that the position and the lionization of the merchant as hero was an important factor in several literary texts, including Addison's The Spectator, that we have already taken a look at. It is then with those comments that I would like to bring this discussion to an end. Tomorrow, we begin with Robinson Crusoe and the composition and the history of and the sources of its composition. Thank you very much for your patience and for attending this session. I look forward to seeing you once again tomorrow.